discussing ethical decision-making in video games and lessons we can draw from moral psychology to help in their design. I'll also be presenting the results of some empirical research we've been doing here at Macquarie into the effect of morality meters on players' decisions. So as a brief outline of my talk, first I'll introduce myself and the team that I work with at Macquarie and the kinds of research that we're doing. Then I'll dive into a short history of moral psychology, focusing in particular on a theory called the four-component model, which I believe provides useful insight into how we make moral decisions both in games and in the real world. From this, I'll go on to present 4 lenses for thinking about the design of ethical decisions in games based on this theory. I'll illustrate each lens with examples from existing games. Finally, I'll conclude with some interesting results from a recent experiment we've been conducting where we've looked at how morality meters affect players' decision making. First, a little bit about me. So I am a teacher, researcher, and game designer. I am the program leader of the Game Design and Development program at Macquarie University, and I also lead the Serious Games Research Network, which is a collection of researchers from different academic backgrounds interested in the use of games for education, advocacy, and health. In my spare time, I develop and publish my own games under the banner of Words on Play. I've designed a couple of mobile games and a tabletop card game. My main research area is exploring how players make ethical decisions in games and how games can be used as tools for ethical training. In this project, I work with a team of academics from a variety of different backgrounds, including Dr. Dan Staines, Associate Professor Paul Formosa, Dr. Mitchell McEwen, Dr. Stephanie Howarth, and Associate Professor Jane Messer. As you can see, we come from a variety of different backgrounds, including philosophy, psychology, cognitive science, computing, and creative arts. We believe in making games as an important part of our research, rather than just studying existing titles. So I want to show you a couple of the games that we've been working on. Making our own games gives us greater insight into the design problems faced when making moral choices in games, and it also provides us with a flexible platform for providing a variety of experiments, as we have the complete source of the game and we can make as many different versions as we like to test the different research questions. We also think it's important to make complete, polished games that are genuinely fun experiences worth playing for their own sake. Far too often, research games are the kind of games you would only play because you're being paid to, essentially. This is extra work, but it means that we know players are not just playing because we told them to. So I'll be talking a little bit in this session about our game The Great Fire, which is a film noir visual novel set in country town, Australia, in a cinema in the 1940s. This was a game we developed in particular for studying the effects of morality meters, which I'll be presenting later in this talk. Our most recent game is a cybersecurity management simulation designed as a simulation of an office team addressing various cybersecurity problems, and it's designed to teach the concepts of cyber ethics to university cybersecurity students. This research project in games and ethics has been going on for over a decade, and we have a variety of publications. For this talk, I'm going to be focusing on 2 of these in particular. This DIGRA paper on focus, sensitivity, judgment, and action, and our most recent games and culture paper on morality meters and their impact on moral choices. However, I'll be giving you pointers to other of our research papers later on if you're interested in following up. So when we talk about games and ethics, there are a number of different things we could mean. To make things a little bit more specific, we'll be focusing on talking about ethical decisions in games, not the ethics of the industry itself. Within that context, we focus particularly on single-player experiences in games like The Walking Dead, This War of Mine, Undertale, etc. Of course, ethical questions also arise in multiplayer games like EVE Online or DayZ, in which players can choose how to interact with other players, and ethical questions arise out of that. Some of the ideas I'll be presenting here are also relevant to those games, but it's not the focus of our research. So a brief history of moral psychology. So our research draws inspiration from this field, and it's a field that's seen a lot of work in the past 50 years. So the fundamental question of moral psychology is not the philosophical question of what is moral, but rather the psychological question of how do we go about making moral decisions? What is the brain doing when we are faced with a moral question? There are a number of different schools of thought on this issue, but roughly speaking, you can break it down into three sort of camps. There are those who follow philosopher Immanuel Kant in thinking that morality is grounded in conscious rational thought. And so when you make a moral decision, you use your rationality in order to decide what the morally correct thing is to do. On the other hand, there are those who follow David Hume and believe that morality is intuitive and driven more by our emotions than by our thinking. Hume would claim that our rational morality only exists to give post hoc rationalizations of what were initially our gut instincts. Modern neuroscience then suggests that both of these views are partly correct. Study of the brain and the cognitive study of our minds indicate that there are both fast, intuitive, and slow, deliberative systems that are at play in any decision we make. And so, like other forms of decision-making, morality engages both of these systems. So some of our decisions will be instinctive and intuitive, but some of our decisions will be made slowly and deliberatively. Our immediate response to a moral problem will be based more on our emotions and our intuitions, but this can be overridden by conscious choice. And through practice, we can turn our conscious moral thinking into automatic intuitions. So we can, by repeatedly overriding our intuitions, we can create new automatic responses. This is a process called this is called the dual process model of morality. So one of the main psychological theories that embraces this dual process model is called the four-component model. And this has been, it was originated by psychologist James Rest and has been continued by a number of his colleagues. And basically, the model breaks down moral thinking into four different skill areas: moral focus, moral sensitivity, moral judgment, and moral action. Moral focus is our motivation to act morally and give consideration to moral issues. This can be just a general predisposition towards giving importance to moral issues, but it can also be affected by circumstances. We may or may not regard a problem as morally relevant, and depending on the nature of the problem. And we can be blind to the moral considerations at hand, even if we consider ourselves necessarily a moral person. And so moral motivation or moral focus is our ability to bring to bear our morality on a particular situation. This then connects to moral sensitivity, which is the ability to recognize the morally salient issues in a situation. So, for example, if you were faced with a moral problem, you might recognize that there are issues such as compassionate considerations or fairness or loyalty or obedience to an authority or other kinds of factors that you need to take into account when making a moral decision. Moral sensitivity is our ability to read the world in a moral sense and see what are the important moral issues that at play in a situation. Moral judgment is then our ability to weigh up these issues and make a choice, and this involves following appropriate codes of ethics and moral philosophies or whatever your personal ethical rules might be, which allow you to make a decision about what you ought to do. Finally, we need to put that decision into action, and so moral action is our ability to put that moral judgment into effect. And moral action can involves more than just making the choice. Moral action might require courage or persistence or social negotiation or a number of other skills that are necessary in order to take your moral decision and put it into action in the world. So these four components then allow us to think about moral decision-making in more fine-grained way and think about different aspects of a moral problem that we can use when designing games. And so I like to think about these components as lenses for design. In the spirit of Jesse Schell, who in his book of lenses presented a variety of lenses as provocations or questions for us as designers. We're not trying to provide you with answers as to the right way of making a morally engaging game. Rather, these different components ask different questions and open up space for thinking about a variety of different solutions. So I want to look at each one in turn and think about the considerations that each lens will, so the kinds of questions that we should ask ourselves when designing games according to each lens. So first, the lens of moral focus. The lens of moral focus asks us, why should morality be a priority to the player? Many games don't require morality to be a priority. Many games expect the player to put their moral sensibilities on hold where they're playing and just enjoy the challenge of winning. And so if you want your player to engage morally with your game, we need to invite them to play and play reflectively and consider the moral significance of their actions rather than just whether they're going to win or lose. This can be done in a variety of ways. For example, putting the player into a position of moral authority can engage their moral focus. The Walking Dead, for example, does this by making you a mentor and a guardian to young Clementine. When you make decisions in the game, you're informed that Clementine will remember this, and you become more aware of the moral significance of your actions when seeing them through her eyes. Another way to engage the player's moral focus is by humanizing the other characters in the game, allowing the player to witness the emotional effect that your choices have over other characters. Many games, again, have the opposite effect of dehumanizing their non-player characters, and we're invited to treat characters more as expendable units rather than as humans in their own right. The Darkest Dungeon is a very interesting example of a game that explores this tension between characters as units that we use in order to achieve our goals and characters that have their own personalities and their own inner worlds who are affected by our decisions. Mechanically, you're invited to treat characters as weapons that are thrown mercilessly against your enemies. However, the dialogues that the characters produce along the way and the way that they respond to situations imbues them with individuality and personality. This can make the player reluctant to sacrifice a party member with whom they've built a long-term relationship throughout the game. And this is one of the key moral questions of Darkest Dungeon, is how do you balance this sense of these characters as people and these characters as units that you're using in achieving your goal. Another way to engage moral focus is by offering, obviously, direct feedback on the player's decisions, either through an explicit morality meter or through NPCs who respond to the player's choices, and it may affect the player's reputation. As we'll show later, morality meters can have interestingly mixed effects on the player's moral focus. So then the lens of moral sensitivity asks us, how does the player recognize moral significance in the game? The main question here is, how obviously are the moral issues signposted to the player? Very common form of moral decision is the branching dialogue choice in an RPG, such as Mass Effect or The Walking Dead. Often in such games, the moral decision is laid out for the player with cases made for and against each side of the choice, so there is little call for moral sensitivity. On the other hand, it is possible to design choices more subtly. My favourite example of this comes from the game Firewatch. The overarching question in that game is essentially whether the protagonist is going to stay faithful to his sick wife or pursue a new relationship with another woman that he's just met, significantly called Delilah. As a first-person game, you never actually see the protagonist's face, but you do see his hands throughout the game, and at the beginning of the game, the character is wearing a wedding ring. Towards the middle of the game, you wake up one day without your ring on, and if you look around the hut in which you're sleeping, you can find it on a table. And at that point, you're presented with the choice, very simple choice, of whether to put your ring back on or put it back down on the table. As far as I'm aware, this choice has no effect in the game, other than from that point on, your hands are seen with or without the ring. However, it has a great significance to the player as it represents a decision as to whether or not they're going to hold on to the marriage or whether they put the marriage aside in order to pursue a new relationship. I find this a very interesting moral choice because it isn't scaffolded at all in the sense of telling you what the choice might mean or what the different sides of it are. It's very much presented as the simple act of putting on a ring or taking it off, and yet is imbued with a much greater significance. From a design perspective, it's remarkable how such a big decision can be offered with almost no signposting in this sense. An alternative to this sort of scripted moral choice is to build moral significance into a systemic game. For example, by making economic decisions about resource allocation in a simulation game like SimCity. This can give the player a much broader range of alternatives to explore, but it also restricts our ability to present commentary on the morality of the player's action. And so it leaves it much more up to the player to interpret the morality of what they're doing and without an explicit narrative to highlight the relevant issues and provide moral feedback. The lens of moral judgment then is asked us, how does the player choose what to do? Given the information that they know about the situation, what are their options and what are they going to choose to do? The big question here is to think about whether you're creating true moral dilemmas or whether you're creating what we would call moral temptations. A temptation is a choice between a moral outcome and an immoral outcome. Sometimes this is weighing up self-interest versus the interests of others, for example, getting a payoff for doing something which harms other people. Or else it could be actually deliberately choosing an evil path for the sake of roleplay, deliberately choosing something that causes suffering to others. Experimental evidence looking at this kind of choice in video games shows that players will almost always choose the good alternative in such a decision, at least on their first playthrough. So an important question to consider when designing such a situation is whether having an evil choice is a good option at all, given that the majority of players will not choose that option. An example of this kind of choice is the power of the atom quest in Fallout 3. In fact, and I find this a particularly egregious example. The player in this quest is asked to choose whether to disarm or detonate a nuclear bomb in the middle of a populated town. There is very little real motivation for detonating the bomb except for a kind of cartoonishly wicked delight in mass murder. On the other hand, a much more nuanced example from the Oasis quest shows how you can design a moral dilemma with multiple alternatives that all have moral weight. In the Oasis quest, the player is asked to assist a character, Harold, with ending his own life. Now, Harold has reasons to want to die, but there are also a variety of other NPC characters who live in and around Harold and who rely on him for various different reasons. These characters will present different points of view as to whether Harold should live or die, with moral reasons in support of both choices. This makes for a much more interesting and nuanced choice for the player, because there is no simple good choice, no obvious good choice here. There are arguments for all the alternatives, although they still couldn't resist adding a cartoonishly, evil choice of killing Harold with as much suffering as possible. The force of moral judgment can be reinforced also by repetition and variation. So often in these kinds of games, we face a wide variety of different choices and which don't really relate to one another very well. But we can create more ethical continuity by repeating the same choices or giving choices with different variations on the same theme. For example, if the players are willing to steal in order to save a dying child, are they also willing to steal to save a condemned criminal? By creating different variations of the dilemma, we encourage the player to establish an ethical identity for themselves over time and investigate the line between what they are willing and unwilling to do. In a similar vein, we can consider how a moral choice is presented. Are we presenting the choice as a single big choice or as the cumulative result of a number of small choices? We could imagine how, for example, a version of the Megaton quest in which the player performs a variety of tasks which help achieve the goal of blowing up the town, but without making it all apparent all at once. Instead, it could be a series of seemingly innocuous crimes that really have no victim, which makes the player slowly complicit in the eventual destruction of the town. And the player must decide at which point they're willing to take a stand against this decision. Again, systemic gameplay can particularly permit this kind of aggregation of small choices to have a larger moral themes. Papers, Please is a good example of this kind of gameplay. In that game, there are very few big moral choice moments. Rather, your morality is made up of the aggregation of the small choices you make from person to person, and whether you're going to help them or not, and balancing this against the needs of your family and the needs of others. The economic aspects of this game are interesting in that every choice you make affects your income, and so while you can't always afford to make all the moral decisions that you'd like to, and you have to decide whether you're going to prioritize one person over another, or whether or else your family may starve and you'll lose your job. So weighing up the relative merits of obeying the law, keeping a husband and wife together, or helping the victims of sex trafficking, or saving your own skin, all have to be considered in a single big moral context rather than as individual standalone questions. Finally, the lens of moral action asks how the player's moral choices are put into effect in the world. In some games, in fact in many games, this is done simply by saying so. The player is presented with a decision and they make their choice. And once the choice is made, the action is done. This is especially common in games like in RPGs like Mass Effect, where other people will ask you what to do and then you make a decision and then it is just automatically put into effect in the real world. Now obviously in real life moral choices can be much more difficult than this to implement. They might require courage or persistence or communication skills. And we can do the same in our games. We can, rather than just presenting them with a moral decision and then implementing it immediately, we can ask the player to carry out the decisions and give them the possibility of failure. This complicates the decision because now we need to assess whether we have the capacity to do what we intend. Just because we know what is the moral choice doesn't mean that we actually have the capacity to put that into action, and we need to take that into account in our choices. A game that illustrates this in an interesting way is We Should Talk by Whitehorn Games. In this game, you're managing a difficult situation in your relationship with your partner, and doing so by a text message. Rather than offering the traditional dialogue tree, the game works by allowing you to construct sentences out of smaller components. You're more restricted in what you can say, but you have a greater scope in how you can express them by choosing particular words to express an idea. And this means that you can express yourself with different kinds of emotion. You can be cool and detached, or you can be playful, or you can be kind of upset or express other kinds of emotion. Making the right choice in terms of what you want to say to your player has to engage your social skill of reading the tone of the message and considering how it might be taken by the recipient. You can have all the best intentions in the world, but screw things up by a carelessly chosen word, which makes the moral action much more challenging and much more engaging. So these lenses I presented are largely theoretical, and these have been drawn from moral psychology and through the investigation of a variety of games, but we're interested in thinking empirically and testing them out and seeing what they look like in effect when we use them to design games and how players respond to them. And so we've started doing a variety of experiments by creating games with different design interventions and seeing how they affect players' decision making. One question that is often debated both in academic and industry contexts is around the use of morality meters or karma meters as a visible gauge of player morality. Typically these represent the player character's morality on a spectrum between some range of heroically good and despicably evil. Some actions the player takes will carry a morality score, which adds or subtracts points from the meter depending on whether the action is deemed good or evil. These meters are obviously contentious. On one hand, they prompt moral motivation by showing that morality matters in the game, and they ask the player to consider the moral value of their actions. On the other hand, they're often accused of oversimplifying morality and reducing it to just a point scoring exercise. And so players are driven to optimize their score rather than choose what's right for its own sake. We're interested in exploring this question experimentally and seeing exactly how does a morality meter affect a player's experience of the game, and how does it affect the choices that they make in a game. I don't have time to present the entire experiment here, but I'll share with you a couple of its more interesting insights. So as I said earlier, the game The Great Fire was designed for this experiment. The Great Fire is a visual novel game, and it includes 8 key ethical questions where the player is faced in making a choice between 2 options. For this presentation, we'll focus on the effect of the morality meter on these choices. So each choice was labelled with 1 good option and 1 evil option, which would affect the value of a morality meter, which was shown at the top of the screen all the time. In this screenshot, you can also see this player is facing a timed question with only 7 seconds later. But for the results that I'll be presenting here, we'll be working with an untimed version of the game in which the player could take as long as they like to make this decision. So there are 8 key pivotal choices in the game representing a variety of different moral structures. So the first choice was just a training choice in order to get the player accustomed to the interface, and then the remaining choice were grouped in pairs with 2 moral temptations that weighed self-interest against morality, and 2 that gave the player opportunity to deliberately cause harm to another. There was also a non-moral choice in which the player had to call heads or tails in a coin flip, and finally there were 2 moral dilemmas based on the trolley problem, in which the player had to decide whether to sacrifice 1 life in order to save 3. The first of these choices was a no-contact version, in which the deaths were decided by pulling a lever and happened off-screen. The second choice was designed to be more confronting, with the player kicking the chair out from underneath a man with a noose around his neck in order to save the life of 3 unknown others. The numbers here that I show in green show the popularity of each choice when players played the game without a morality meter. So as you can see, for the majority of choices, there was a clear popular option which agreed with what we might label as the intuitively good option. Don't steal, don't cause unnecessary harm, save more lives, save 3 lives over 1. However, you'll notice for the second trolley problem, the outcomes turned out to be exactly 50-50 split between killing 1 and letting 3 people die, which tells us that this is an interestingly ambiguous moral problem. We then implemented 3 different versions of the morality meter, one which labelled all the popular options as good and recommended not to kill in this particular question, one that rated all the unpopular actions, including stealing and kicking an innocent dog, as good and recommended to kill, and one that started out intuitively good but switched to counterintuitively for the 2 trolley problem dilemmas. We're interested to see how players responded to each of these meters. Would players blindly follow a meter that recommended obviously evil outcomes, or would they rebel against it? If the meter was apparently good but switched its stances, would it be more influential on them? So briefly summarise these in this graph. You can see here the percentage of people who chose the intuitively good option for each decision in the 4 different colours. Compare the results from the no meter version of the game, which we presented earlier, with the 3 different meter conditions. As you can see, for most of the choices, there is very little difference between the different versions of the game. Players mostly choose the intuitively good option regardless of what the meter told them. However, when we get to the 2 trolley problems, we can see the meter begins to have an influence. In particular, in the most ambiguous case, in decision 7, we can see that the intuitive meter, which recommended not to kick the chair, significantly increased the number of players who chose this option. Likewise, the mixed meter, which recommended not to kick the chair, significantly decreased the number of players who chose this. However, the counterintuitive meter, which recommended evil options throughout, had no effect. So it seems interesting here that the players chose to disregard this meter entirely. The meter, however, was not entirely without influence. If we look back to decision 4, which was the non-moral choice, where the player was calling heads or tails on a coin flip, the counterintuitive meter recommended that the players call tails instead of the more popular choice of heads. And here we see that it has indeed had this effect. There's a significant drop in the number of players who called heads for this choice, indicating that players were motivated to follow the meter, but only when there was no moral reason for choosing differently. This says something interesting about how players regard the meter. First of all, our concerns that the player would disregard morality in order to optimise their scores were unfounded. When there was an obvious good thing to do, the meter had very little effect on players' choice. However, when the moral choice was more ambiguous, the meter did have a choice, but have an influence, but only if it had already established its moral legitimacy. This seems to indicate that players regard the meter as a source of moral advice rather than as a score to be followed, but only so long as the meter has been shown to reflect their own moral standards. If the meter doesn't reflect their standards, the players are generally regarded to inclined to disregard the meter. However, they still don't totally ignore it. When the opportunity to score good points arises without any moral cost, players seem inclined to take it. So this seems like there is an interesting and more complicated relationship going on here with the meter than the simple idea of obeying the meter that we expected. We have actually a lot more data than this, but this one result gives us an interesting perspective on how to think about morality meters. They do influence player choices, but not necessarily in the obvious way that we might have expected. And that it matters what the player's long-term assessment is of the morality expressed by the meter and whether it matches with the player's own morality. And this is really all we have time for. I hope that I've given you an interesting taste of the research that we're doing in this area. Of course, if you're interested in following into this further, I recommend reading our Morality Play blog, where we present easily digestible versions of our own research papers and also those of other researchers in the field. There are also links from the blog where you can play the games that we've been talking about yourself. Of course, feel free to email me if you have any further questions or suggestions for this research. We're very keen to collaborate with game developers who are working on the ground with these sorts of questions, and to use our research to create more ethically complex and more morally engaging games. Thank you for your attention.